Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We're going to be talking about DNS firewalling and specifically how you are able to do that, implement DNS firewalling in Bind. So today's webinar is a joint presentation between ISC and Deteque, who is a division of Spamhaus and Security Zones. So our logistics for today is the webinar is scheduled to be about 1 hour long. We will provide some time at the end for questions and hopefully answers. So we do want your questions. So during the webinar, you can enter those at any time into the chat window. There are some that we may answer while we're in progress, but most likely, most of them will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. Know that everyone is muted so that we don't have any audio problems for everyone. And we will be recording this webinar, or hopefully we will be recording. I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulty on that side, but assuming we get a recording, that will be posted and likely followed up with you via email to let you know the recording is ready if and when it is. So our presenters today, right now you're listening to myself, Eddie Winstead. I've been doing DNS and DHCP and sysadmin for 25 plus years. And then we have Matt Stith, who is a product manager over at Spamhaus-Deteque. We're going to be having a case study as part of this webinar, which is, to me, those are the most exciting parts. And Matt was intimately involved in the case study that we are going to present. So he will be talking about what he did for that implementation. So at the beginning, we're going to just talk about the very basics of DNS firewalling, how we got here, how we invented RPZ. RPZ was invented at ISC, and RPZ is Response Policy Zones, in case you don't know what the acronym is. And then we'll get into that case study that we talked about, or that I just mentioned. And then Matt's going to also guide you through how you would get started with a trial of RPZ. Now, as members or attendees of this webinar, you do get an extended free trial of RPZ feeds from Spamhaus and Security Zone. So we'll have information on how you sign up for that if you're interested towards the end of the webinar. So why do you need a DNS firewall? Well, if you've been doing sysadmin and internet services for as long as I have, you're probably very familiar with when spam happened, and it really changed the way a lot of us on the internet had to operate our equipment. So there was the rise of spam, and then the rise of trying to prevent spam in some way, prevent the spam from ending up in our email boxes. So if you're around the internet during those times, you'll be very familiar with the concept that we're going to be talking about here. So and you probably remember the Spamhaus name from those days. There was a way to determine reputation data essentially about folks that or servers that were sending email, and you could subscribe to these services, and essentially there were techniques that you could use to prevent your inbox from being flooded with mail from these known spam operators. So when we talk about DNS firewalling, I want to be clear that we're talking about doing this on the recursive side of things. So in the DNS ecosystem, you have your clients, you have your recursive servers that handle questions on behalf of those clients, and then you have authoritative servers which provide answers back based on questions that recursive servers are asking on behalf of those clients. So when we talk about DNS firewalling, we're really talking about that relationship between the clients, the DNS clients, and the resolvers themselves. So in today's internet and today's DNS, if you're running a resolver, you know that you certainly get a lot of legitimate queries, but these days you are oftentimes overwhelmed with the ones we have listed here. You can have botnet command and control queries, malware queries, phishing queries. There's all sorts of malicious activity that makes use of the DNS while which you have to provide for your clients for their services to work. The malicious parties are also making use of that same layer. And so that's what we're trying to protect here. So the very basic concept is, again, back to this sort of reputation thing. There are feeds or a list or reputation data that is being created by various parties, and we'll talk about those parties as we go along. But the basic idea is essentially you have these lists or RPZ feeds, as we will talk about them in this webinar, and they are based on seeing malicious behavior in the DNS. So by watching DNS queries and responses, we can start to see if clients, have already been compromised and they're querying back, doing DNS queries back to command and controls. We can see when clients are asking for DNS queries that might lead them along the path to becoming a new infection. And then we can also start to see when a client may be requesting DNS questions that may indicate that they are being targeted for some sort of phishing attempt. And the main thing with this is we want to provide this protection for the clients while also continuing to answer our legitimate queries as they come in and in a timely fashion. So the internet resolver landscape has certainly changed over the last, decade or so. Most of us are familiar with the Google public DNS 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4. You can certainly point clients at those resolvers. There's a similar undertaking with quad9.net that just launched this past November. And then you can do, straight up outsourcing or paying people to do recursive DNS for you. OpenDNS is a common provider, as is Akamai. Your other alternative is to do it as as it was done in, the original DNS design, and that is having your resolvers, in-house. Now, I mentioned some of the free resolvers. Free is sort of a mixed term, right? We know that if we're not providing the service ourselves, then our data is being leaked to those providers. And whether or not you have an issue with that depends on the type of organization you are and what your policies are. Some people are fine with that, and that's entirely okay. But if you have a need to keep your client data in-house, or you want to keep that client data in-house, then you're certainly going to have to run DNS resolvers yourself. In terms of whether or not you outsource, pay someone to do your resolution services, you could most likely do this at a lower cost if you do this in-house. You could also have, of course, greater control, and exactly what we're talking about today. You can provide some of these filtering services in-house that some of the outsourced resolver services are now providing. So again, RPZ is response policy zones, and it's exactly what I've already said, that we have the ability, or organizations have the ability to create some reputation data based on what is being seen in the DNS. You can then feed these lists or these RPZ feeds. You can transfer them to the resolvers that want to implement this, and you do this via, the good news is you do this via standard zone transfer mechanisms that are already well baked into the DNS protocol. So we're not talking about any new fashion or any new way in which we're receiving DNS data to provide back to clients. This is all done either incremental zone transfers or AXFR as well. So what RPZs will include are what we're going to filter on, and then or what's going to trigger a filter, and then what we're going to provide back with that once that trigger has been met. And if you do this in bind, this is where exactly, what we're saying there. If you match a filter in the RPZ, then we're going to apply a specific policy. And again, Matt is going to take you through exactly how you would do this configuration-wise on a bind server. So what this looks like is, you'll notice that the client request is coming into a bind server here. The bind server is going to go ahead and still recurse. So even if this is a known query name that we might have some suspicions about, we're going to go ahead and do recursion. We're going to go ahead and look up in our cache, and we're going to figure out what that response would be. Then bind will do some checks to see, is that response contained in these RPZ zones that we have. We're able to match whether it's, is this a client IP who requested this? Is the answer IP something, an IP address that we're concerned about? It's a potentially malicious address. Is the name server address or name server name known to be a name server that provides malicious DNS responses for other domains? So once we go through all that, we can then apply a policy and rewrite the response if we like. Some of the most common ones are NX domain, no data, local data, or drop. And of course, we're going to do logging. So the logging piece is, of course, very important when you're doing stuff like this. So again, these are the possible triggers that you can use for in bind. QName, of course, the question that's asked. Client IP, if this is a certain client that needs some extra, I don't know, extra special filtering, if you will. And then the IP of that's being returned in the answer, is that known to be a malicious IP? And then the same thing with name server names and name server IPs. Are they known to be malicious? And if they are, then we can do things with that response. And again, the actions listed there are the most common. NX domain, so to the client, that would look like they looked up this malicious domain and it doesn't exist. So they essentially, their transaction ends there. No data is also a very common one, essentially saying the name you requested exists, but not of the type, the record type that you requested. Pass-through is another one. There are cases of whitelisting where we may want to pass through some domains that we have a certain relationship with or whatever. We'll talk about some we'll give you a link to a nice whitelisting article towards the end of the webinar. Again, one of the more commons is local and, drop. And then another common one is local data. So essentially you're providing a walled garden of sorts for the client to be directed to possibly alert them to contact your staff that maybe they have an issue with their computer. So with that, I'm going to, before I turn it over, I do want to say that Rackspace is a very valued customer of ISC. We actually participated in this implementation that Rackspace did, but ISC's participation was on the other side of things. So as a customer, Rackspace was able to open tickets as they were deploying their RPZ, and they've actually, I'll get into this a little bit later after Matt's presentation, but they actually pointed out some things. They saw some issues. This was a very large deployment. So they saw some issues that they were concerned about. And we were actually able to address those with them and during their implementation. So it was very fun. Rackspace, they always push the limits of what folks are doing with bind. So we're very appreciative of that, and they give us a lot of fun stuff to work on. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt to talk about the actual case study.
All right, thank you very much, Eddie. First of all, I want to point out and give a shout out to Jason Bratton, who is on the webinar today. He is actually the real hero of getting RPZ established at Rackspace, and just wanted to give him a quick shout out. And he's very, very, very knowledgeable about the implementation that happened there. So a little bit of backstory about myself. I'm the product manager here at Spamhaus-Deteque. And previously for 8 years, I was working on the abuse desk at Rackspace. So that's why I have a little bit of knowledge of what was going on during the time of getting RPZ set up. So we're going to just go right into this case study here. So Rackspace is a large managed service provider, offers dedicated hosting services, cloud hosting services, and email hosting services as well. So with that large infrastructure, Rackspace decided to do something about protecting some of our customers that were using our actual DNS infrastructure. And we just wanted to make sure that we were able to protect them as much as possible, and also be able to mitigate some of the problems that may happen when somebody becomes infected. It wasn't usually the problem of bad bad companies. It was actually either a fraud or a compromise that was causing any of this outbound activity to happen on our network. So after extensive testing through all of our data centers, we decided to implement RPZ in October of 2016. So we're going to now look at a beautiful graph that shows you more or less some of the malicious traffic that we were actually able to correlate back on, and sees that it just drops off of a cliff. So this traffic right here, it's not an enormous amount of traffic in the grand scheme of everything is doing, but it was significant to the customers that had been compromised, taken advantage of in some way, be it an exploit, be it something that was out of date, and we were able to instantaneously mitigate that. So it was just to be able to drop all of that traffic to zero, and we were able to proactively put those customers to make sure that they resolved any of the issues that were happening on their servers. And if they were unresponsive, we were the team that was monitoring this was able to reach out to the abuse team and let them know, hey, we need to reach out to this customer and make sure that they fix this. But what you really ran into here is you didn't have customers that were going to end up generating large bills or large support costs or end up churning because of this. So we were able to actually be a little bit more, as Rackspace says, fanatical in the way that we were dealing with the customers there and helping them mitigate themselves. So the next thing that we're looking at here is the blocked domains per policy list. So this is per each list that Rackspace was consuming, what we were able to block the account of domains. So I'm going to look at this one real fast, but then we're going to go to this one that is the policy hit count. So as you can see here, the drop list actually hit a ton more on terms of what was being hit. Yet if you go back to that first list, it wasn't the very number one by far on what was being dropped. It was more the botnet CCs that was being dropped. So as it says here on this slide, it's not always about the number of hits. It may be about what something is connecting to, not how many times it's trying to connect to it, because if something is trying to connect to something that's already compromised and trying to spread itself out, being able to just block a specific domain may be more effective than what could happen in another circumstance. So it isn't always about the number of hits. It may be about just the domain. If you think about it in terms of the ransomware domain that was trying to be contacted when ransomware really started to ramp up, being able to block that just domain would have much more effect than the number of hits that were happening. So this is over the initial implementation, the number of domains blocked, the RPZ hits, and the number of devices protected. So we were able to protect all of these customers and help mitigate and help educate them in ways that they can better manage because that's what Space wants to do, is help customers better manage their environments, better understand. And I'm sure that other people that are on this call today also want to help their customers manage their environments a little bit better. So from the Rackspace experience, we were able to see this instantaneous mitigation. Once we turned it on, it was just like that. It just dropped right off. We were able to notify those users and help them understand. And also, it was able to let us see, are there other people that may have this same issue on our network, may not be infected yet, or may not be running into this same problem, and we can let our support and abuse teams be more aware of the things that are happening on our network. So you're able to have that more visualized understanding of this is what's happening. And then from a personal perspective, being on the abuse desk, we were able to see about a 20 to 30% drop in our abuse desk tickets. Now, this came over time as RPZ moved along, but just seeing that drop in complaints, the size of the abuse desk that Rackspace has, just being able to give them that little bit more was able to let us concentrate on other things, customer education and employee education as well. So we were able to provide all of that information and be able to just have an easier time with helping out our customers. And that's again what Rackspace is about. So I did want to say that Jason is unmuted and able to talk. Jason, did you have any feedback that you wanted to give regarding the case study?
No, honestly, you really did a great job at capturing most of it. The biggest help for us with RPZ is that rather than having to be reactive, whereas in the past we were, we would see large spikes in DNS queries and we would have to react to them, and by then, something bad might have already happened. RPZ allowed us to be more proactive, where we were actually in real time able to take these feeds and block bad things before they ever even became a problem in the first place. So I can't speak highly enough about what RPZ has given to us in terms of being able to help protect our customers and also even our own internal infrastructure.
All right. Well, excellent, Jason. I appreciate the feedback there. That case study is available on Security Zone's website. It is linked up there in the first page of my part of the presentation, and will be available when we finish up. So, on to the next thing. We're going to talk about getting started with RPZ, with response policy zones. So, we're talking about here is just enabling RPZ for use of Spamhaus' free drop zone. You can add in your own zones as needed from other locations or other providers, or anything that you're able to get. Just make sure that anything that you're going to be putting into your configuration is going to be good data that you tested out. So we're going to be looking at enabling logging, creating your local zone, defining your master and slave zones, and finally enabling RPZ. So very first thing that we're going to talk about here is just enabling logging. So something that you would be putting into your named configuration file. And what you're doing here is you're just defining the RPZ log. Now, why you want to do this first is with anything that you're going to be making changes to your DNS, you probably want to see what's happening when it's making actions on your resolver. In impacting your customers. So you want to make sure that it's something that you had set up first, and it's not like the last thing that you do. So this is a pretty straightforward setup of a logging configuration. We just have unlimited versions, and we have them set at 1,000 megabytes apiece. So each time the log reaches 1,000 megs, it goes to a new log. So you're not having an entirely huge, humongous one file. And then everything else in here, the print time, print category, print severity, and severity info, just gives you the information that you need to be able to troubleshoot, be able to identify things, be able to gather statistics. And it doesn't matter what order that you put those. The order that it's listed in here is how it's going to actually print out in the log for you. The next thing that you're going to want to do after you've done your logging is set up so what you want to do with this local zone is you want to be able to set your own policy. So you would put things in here that even though the feeds that you're getting are high quality, there may be the possibility that a mistake may happen at some point, form or fashion. And don't want to end up having your own domain listed within the RPZ and then customers within your network that are using your DNS resolvers not be able to resolve. So you want to put your high value things in here. So anything that's within your network that must be accessed at all times is something that you want to put in here. The additional thing that you can do is you can add in your own block list in here. So if you find somebody clicked on a phishing website, got owned, but it was sent to all 5,000 of your employees, you can instantaneously mitigate that by, okay, we got this one guy owned, he owned up to it, and this is what happened. You would be able to add this into your local block zone, so anybody else who happened to click on it, you actually would be able to see the hit that one of your employees actually clicked on that, and you go back to them and be able to do the education of, look, you fell for this phishing email. This is this is something that you shouldn't do. Be a little bit more vigilant, and just give them the exercise of understanding this is how you detect a phishing email. Here are some of the things that that are representative of what a phishing email looks like. So that's one thing that you can zone, and which also leads to, you always want to have this local zone be the first thing in your priority. How you set priority in RPZ, anything that's listed first when you do your enablement is the very first thing that will be acted upon. And the next thing that you want to do is you want to be able to define these zones. And this definition here is for a master zone, and your local zone is going to be a master zone. It's something that is local within your environment. So this is just defining the zone that you just created, and this is defining this within your name configuration. And you always want to make sure that you're allowing your query from inside your network. In some cases, your allow query, if you have multiple resolvers, you actually want to have the internal IPs of those resolvers within the allow query. So only these specific hosts can do these RPZ lookups. The next is where we're going to talk a little bit about what Spamhaus offers. This is Spamhaus's drop zone. Now, this is a zone that we offer absolutely free, and anybody out there on the internet can access this. We do require that you do go to our website and sign up, just so we can have security around these masters that we have set up, and we don't have everything just going as a free-for-all, and that we have everybody understand that with the access to this data becomes a little bit of responsibility in how you access it and how you use it. But the only difference here between this is, of course, the zone that you're pulling and the type. So this is a slave zone, and you're pulling these two master IPs, the 35 dot and the 34 dot. And when you just sync up with those, you pull those IPs, you pull the data down, and it populates a file into your RPZ setup. And then finally, the last thing that you're going to do here is enable response policy zones. And as I said earlier, the zone, the very first thing up there is rpz.local. Now you can name that rpz.local anything you want to. Just make sure that it matches up with how you named it in your zone file, and you'll be good to go. And then the second thing that we have on here, as I was saying, is the drop zone. The other thing that I put in here was policy RPZ-pass-through. Now what that means is the zone is defined. However, any action that happens with that zone will be logged, but no action will happen with it. So you'll see that a hit happened on the drop zone, but it will just let it pass through. And that's something that we recommend that somebody does when you first implement. We don't want you to add all of these feeds to your system and then just start enforcing without even testing on your policy. So a couple of notes to consider. One thing that I did not mention at the beginning: please make a backup of your name configuration before you make any changes to it. You don't want to make all of these changes, then realize that something's broken, then have to go back and figure out that you just misplaced a semicolon somewhere, or you didn't put a bracket where it was supposed to be. So make that backup of your name configuration, or you can just make that copy, make all the changes of the copy, and then just flip-flop them as you need to when you're going to be implementing this type of configuration. When you're going to be doing any addition or adding a new zone or just starting out RPZ from scratch, I would say test 10 to 14 days. In some cases, if you're a large corporate infrastructure, you may want to go for maybe 3 weeks, but usually 10 to 14 days is where you're going to see most of what anything's going to happen on your system. That'll be a good indicator for you. And then finally, the local zone should always be listed first in your priority. And then next is most egregious down. So how we would do it is Spamhaus offers 13 zones, and we would usually always recommend like our botnet CC list to be first. So that's how you're getting most of your you're cutting off most of the issues first, and then as everything goes down, you keep on moving through until you reach to the end. And the last thing that you may want to consider in your implementation is do you want to notify your customers that this is something that you're going to implement? Now, I know that Rackspace ran into a couple of things when we first implemented RPZ, and it's we were running into this thing of, do we notify the customers, do we not? It's kind of these are our resolvers, and this is something that we should do. But you know, it's one of those. It's your decision if you want to make that notification to your customers, and it all depends on what your relationship is with them and how that's going to work. And then the other thing about customer notification is if you largely have a group of customers that is just servers, and these aren't end users who are just using your resolvers to access the internet through a web browser, if it's people that are doing it through web browsers, you may want to consider having local data in there. So if somebody actually clicks on a link that is in your RPZ, it would actually direct them to a local data web page that would show them, hey, you clicked on this link, this is potentially a phishing, ransomware, whatever link, and you would give them that education right there and see that there's a problem with something, and that they wouldn't just end up with a 404. But somebody who is coming on from a server standpoint, you sometimes may break things with doing that local data, and just giving them the just block straight up would be something that would be a little bit more user friendly on that type of thing, and they would be able to see it in their logs, and you would also be able to see it within your logs. So some things that has been coming up a lot with RPZ and the things that I've been talking about is some tools that you can use to analyze and look through this. And there isn't a ton out there because it's just not something that is really caught on as much as it should have. And that's why we're doing these types of presentations, so people can understand that, hey, this is something that's very effective, and it's something that you should consider using on your system. So the first thing that you can look at here is Splunk, and Splunk is a real-time log analysis tool that will be able to do all sorts of things. It's highly configurable, but it's also very complicated as well. And if you're a larger corporation, it's going to cost you a lot of money to be able to get your installation set up. But it's a thing that you can look at, and you'll be able to grab those logs that you're generating within RPZ and move them right over and be able to visualize out that data and be able to see the lovely graphs that management goes crazy over. And then the next thing in here is ELK, which is the Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. And I think that they are now calling it the Elastic Stack. This is also a real-time thing. This is an open source that also offers a support element, and you would have to do a lot of this configuration on your own because of just it's an old project, and you'd be able to generate your logs and be able to put them in there. And then the final thing that we have on here is moving all of your log data into a MySQL database or another database like I can't even remember the name right now, but you would be able to do it into another database. And then this is something that you would probably have to do it as a report based. So you'd be able to generate these reports up to the minute, up to the hour. It wouldn't be something that you'd be able to do as real time as you want to, but you'd still be able to generate those numbers and the meaningful data that would help you be able to understand what's happening. And then finally, these are the zones that Spamhaus offers. And as we said at the beginning, the security zones team is actually going to offer an extended trial on this. We usually do a 30-day trial, but we're willing to up it to 90 days. So anybody who is interested in all of these, interested in any of this data, you can see what of these zones you want to be able to use and just be able to test it. Run it through pass-through on your system, and we'd be able to offer that up to you. So with all of that, I'm going to go ahead and give it back to Eddie, and I'm going to go ahead and read over these questions here and see what I can answer. So Eddie, go ahead.
All right, thanks a bunch, Matt. Excellent,
yeah.
Excellent stuff. Also, that was really awesome to have Jason from Rackspace join unexpectedly. Very cool. Thanks a bunch, Jason. And I haven't seen you in a while. We need to resolve that. So, all right. So a little bit about requirements if you're going to implement RPZ in Bind. It will work with Bind 9.9 and later. There has been some refactoring in 9.12 that we highly recommend, particularly if you're going to be a large deployment of RPZ. If you have, I don't know, thousands and thousands of clients, 9.12 is something that you would want to consider. Also, some of the bug fixes that we put in place in response to Rackspace's deployment scenarios are included in 9.12. So again, highly recommend 9.12 if you're going to do a large deployment of RPZ. So as I've mentioned a few times, there are many RPZ feeds available. You're hearing from Spamhaus and Deteque today. And as part of this, being an attendee, as I mentioned, you do get a 90-day free trial of many of their feeds instead of the usual 30 days. Others that offer feeds are Serval, Farsight, and Switch. There's a really good website called DNS RPZ.info that will provide you a nice list both of where you can get feeds and what DNS softwares actually make use of RPZ. So anytime you're going to do any sort of DNS blocking or any blocking of any sort, actually, you want to be on the lookout for any false positives. This is why Matt has talked a lot about potentially doing the log only mode for a while, and as well, he mentioned notifying customers that you are doing a deployment change. You'll want to, of course, subscribe to well-known or well-managed lists. Again, that DNSRPZ.info site is maintained pretty frequently and has really good vetted list of who's providing these feeds. And again, what's the use? The old saying, "What's the use of logging if you don't know what your logs look like in normal operation?" And you certainly want to know what they look like when you're making integration changes. So make sure you're actually taking a look at what RPZ is doing, both before you turn it on and then after you actually do more than just logging. Here's a little plug for ISC's knowledge base. We have a really good article that talks about how you can do whitelisting for your own internal zones. There are scenarios you can run into where you could accidentally block some internal zones, and you certainly don't want to do that. So if you check out this KB article, it will explain to you what your config should look like when you're going to do any whitelisting with RPZ. Again, as I've mentioned, as attending this webinar, you get the 90-day free trial with Spamteq. Matt also pointed out in one of his examples of the slaving the RPZ feed, there is a free, always free Spamhaus zone that you can get that only requires that you contact them and make sure they know that to transfer out to your server. But you can try several of their RPZ feeds, and to sign up for those, you can contact Arnie. And we have an email for Arnie on the very last slide. So we highly recommend. We did this webinar last month, and he's already had some good conversations. So we hope to see that proceed with this webinar as well. Please do contact Arnie and try out their RPZ feeds. Oh, I should mention as well, as part of that trial, they will help you with specific setup and give you some guidance and assistance on that. If you're already an ISC customer as well, we will certainly guide you through setting up your trial zones in RPZ. So if you're an existing customer, just open a ticket and we'll help you through that. If you're not an existing customer, of course, we would encourage you to become one, and we'll be happy to help you with your RPZ configuration and any issues that you might run into. So here is a nice reference slide. And again, this DNSRPZ.info website is really your friend. That's where you can get a lot of great information about RPZ. If you want to refer back to this Rackspace case study without actually going through the slides, there's a link there that you can do that. There's also Security Zones has a nice bind RPZ installation guide that you can reference. And I've already mentioned the KB a bit, but we, of course, also have some information on how you can start using DNS firewalls with bind. So this is our thank you slide. So thank you everyone for attending. We're still going to do questions, so don't drop off just yet. If you want to have any more information about ISC, please do contact us at that email address. And then here's Arnie's email address at Security Zones, so you can begin the process of setting up your free trial. And with that, we're going to start doing our questions. Vicki, you offered in the chat window to read out the questions. I'm totally okay with that. If you want to pick some, Matt, I know you were reading through some of them, so you may have some answers already awaiting.
I was on mute. I was going to go ahead and give Vicki the floor so she can read them out, and then we can answer as needed.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. So let's see. Let me start from. Let's see. The very first one I think was from Grant Taylor. He was asking, does this mean that DNS-based exfiltration can still happen even if bind RPZ is filtering the response to the client? So I went ahead and volunteered that since we're only filtering the response to the client, it can't prevent padding the query. I think that's what he was talking about with the DNS exfiltration. But Eddie or Matt, if you'd like to add to that, go right ahead.
I think your answer was entirely spot on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm guessing Grant knew that when he asked, which is where the question came from. There's another question. What bind versions support RPZ? I fudged a little bit by saying that all of the supported bind versions support RPZ. But I know in reality, we know a lot of people are running much older versions of bind. I remember when it was first introduced, it was somewhere in 9.9.
It was 9.8.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So since 9.8 is EOL and everything prior to 9.8 is EOL, if you're not running EOL software, you do have RPZ support in there.
Yeah, and one thing that we always recommend when anybody's coming on with us is just update your bind to the most recent version. And the reason is because I know that ISC has done a lot of work to make changes to RPZ and fix performance, and also just certain things will work a little bit better. And it's more difficult for us to work on helping get everything implemented if we're having to troubleshoot a issue that was fixed in a more current version. So it's kind of this with updating any software. Just make sure that you're as up to date with the most recent, most stable piece of software. And that's usually what we try and say. But yeah, I think that you're right here with 9.8 and above or RPZ is supported. But as you get more current, the experience is going to be, especially in terms of performance.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Matt is being very politically correct, but the reality is we did fix a lot of bugs in the older versions of RPZ. So we do highly recommend running a more recent patch version. So the next question, more of a technical question, is there any way to override the policy per client? So say either to whitelist a client maybe, or to change the policy on a per client basis.
No. Well, I mean, there isn't an easy way to do it. So more or less what you would have to do is set up other resolvers that aren't using RPZ, and in some way be able to figure out when X client IP next to your resolver redirect to other resolver, and there isn't a good way to do it at this time. I know that that's not a great answer, but there isn't a very good way to do it with how RPZ is currently set up, because you don't want to have to continually redirect somebody to a different resolver based on their client IP, because that's just it could get a little bit messy.
Okay. The next question, can we use your product initially with Splunk just to evaluate destination IPs to see what would be blocked if we were to implement DNS RPZ?
Absolutely. So actually one thing that, here, this is kind of what I just put into the chat, this is just a local log excerpt. I just made that up. And that's kind of what that would look like, and it would show you that the pass-through happened. So you would be able to feed this log data into Splunk and just see that the policy pass-through happened, and you'd be able to just grab that and be able to see where it's trying to go, and no action will be taken. So that's why doing the policy pass-through is so impactful when you first start out. So yes, you can move it into Splunk. It's just the process of moving everything over as the logs get generated into Splunk, and it's just text that's being generated. So you'll just be able to move that over, but it's usually always in this order right here when the log gets generated.
And I think, part of the value of having the longer trial is that you have plenty of time to do whatever analysis you want to do. So the next question is a little bit more involved, and maybe scroll around in the chat. It's from Grant Taylor. He says, please talk to redirecting a local server, how it interacts with HTTP site names. And for example, he gives the example of whitehouse.com in cnameblock.example.net. And let's see, the server name to the local HTTPS server. So I think I'm not sure I understand the question. Eddie, can you see it in the chat window?
So Grant, it wouldn't matter if the site that you're trying to connect to had HTTPS or not. It's being blocked at the resolution, so there isn't the issue of that certificate. It would be redirecting to an internal source. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. So there's another question. Is there a difference in the RPZ feature supported by different versions of bind? I have simply responded that the RPZ features themselves are fairly consistent. Certainly the very early implementations had other features, but the main difference is we fixed a lot of bugs, to be quite frank. And so the main difference between the slightly older implementations and the newer one is not features, but is the stability and the performance.
Yeah.
Grant supplied an improved link to a KB article, which if that was wrong in the slides, that is 100% my fault. I must have fat-fingered it at some point. There are a number of articles in the KB. We were highlighting one that seemed particularly useful. Somebody's asking about the slide deck. We do post on isc.org under the community pull down all of our webinars, slides, as well as the recording. So yes, the slides will be available. I think the slides are already available from a prior webinar, and they are very, very similar, other than things like the dates. So you should already be able to find them. Here's a question.
One quick thing. Robert Willman made a actual Q&A question. It was outside of the chat, and Robert was asking how big is the impact of using the performance of bind. So the biggest performance hit that you're going to see is when you initially first load all of the zones. That's when you're going to see a hit on your performance. But as you after you get all those zones in, as long as you have enough memory on the server, you shouldn't run into any issues with performance from there. And as long as you're also updating via IXFR, which is the incremental updating of the zone files. So it's usually on that first initial loading of all the zones is when you'll see that performance. It's the only time that you're really going to see any issue with performance there.
Okay, let me just look and see. Just a comment. Another job, we had a second set of resolvers people could switch to if necessary, and they got no use. Someone asking about the ETA for 9.12. As the alert observer will note, we did just publish a patch release. We had a security vulnerability that came in right before the holidays, and we have a policy these days of not issuing security vulnerability announcements over the holidays so that people don't have to leave their turkey or their skiing or whatever and go patch. So we had to hold the entire release until after the holidays. We issued with the patch release another release candidate, and the bind release is actually in the process of going up. I'll just check the posting schedule, but it should either be tomorrow or next Wednesday. I'll take a quick look. It is on its way out. Okay, so we have an update on the question from Grant. Grant, I'm just going to enable you to talk if I can find you in the list of people here. Okay, so Grant, I've just enabled you to talk. If you want to just ask your question, oh, no microphone. Okay, so that's not going to work. All right. So Grant says, I'm referring to the internal server, the landing page that would need to answer. Redirecting DNS is one thing. There are complications when the client, oh, okay. So I think Grant's point is if you're replacing the initial response with a different response, and perhaps there's a requirement. Obviously, after the client gets the DNS response, the next thing we're going to do in most cases is make an HTTP connection. And I think he's really pointing out that if you redirect from an HTTPS connection to an unsecure HTTP connection, that could have complications. Eddie, you're welcome to chime in if you have anything more to say about that.
Yeah, and I would just add that you know, obviously if you're doing the wall garden or redirecting someone to a web page, then you're going to have to obviously run a web service that handles that request. So yeah, there is more to it than just the DNS part in that case.
I think that Matt had already commented previously that especially if the clients you're redirecting are application servers rather than humans, there could be some repercussions for giving them a no data or NX domain or something if the server application is expecting something. But the idea here is that you're preventing something worse by redirecting.
Right.
Let's see if there are any other questions here. This is a good question. Good question from Lee Norval. Can RPZ logging work with DNS tab? The DNS tab is a separate specification. There's a schema for what you can put into DNS tab. And unfortunately, we can't just put whatever we want into DNS tab. We have to get it accepted into the schema. And today, DNS tab does not do RPZ logging. It's something I'm very interested in because we've done a lot of work on the DNS log file rotation. And I know there's interest in having some more options for RPZ log file rotation as well. The next part of the question, is there any information on DNS tab /L? Which I assume this is another Elasticsearch question. Matt, do you have any comment about that?
There's nothing really published that is all encompassing there. I mean, more or less, it would be generally how to feed logs into DNS tab. Into ELK. Sorry, read DNS tab, and that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah, it would just be general on how to feed logs into. We're always working on trying to get these things created, and it's probably something that we'll work with ISC once we get closer to figuring out how to write something that is specific to our RPZ. But right now, we don't really have anything that's specific to ELK and getting all of that information in.
Okay, that's all the questions that I see. If anybody else has any other questions, pop them in now. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank both of our presenters. And I posted in the chat window the link to where we post the slides and the recording. And I think we're done. Thank you very much, Matt and Eddie, and everyone who added questions.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Matt. Very, very excellent information.
Yes, thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Until next time, take care.